They called Arnold Palmer the king. You're about to discover the many, many reasons why. We have with us on Leaders and Legends the author of Arnold Palmer, Homespun Stories of the King. And he's joining us all the way from the King's hometown of Latrobe, Pennsylvania. Chris RODELL wrote this fantastic book, arguably the greatest book ever written on
second to the Bible, right?
Second to the Bible, Chris. And first of all, as a way to get started with what we want to explore today, I'm just going to throw you this high, hard fastball. Why is the legend of Arnold Palmer still so relevant today?
It's just something that he created the idea of a sports influencer, somebody that would be important to everybody in marketing. They all follow his plan. So whenever you see LeBron James doing something to attract attention and get money, he's following in Arnold Palmer's footsteps. And he just was a classic gentleman. When I got the assignment for the book, I put a story in the local paper saying, tell me your best Arnold Palmer stories. Here's my phone number. Here's my email address. I got 215 calls and letters. And I thought I'd get one or two saying he was a cheap tipper. He flipped me off in traffic, just something like that. He had a road rage incident. He never had a bad day. Out of the 215 calls, letters, and emails, not one negative story. And this is a town where people, where he was here all the time. So if you wanted to have like a brush with him, you could have it. And he was unfailingly polite and cheerful and fun and just the greatest guy in the world. I like to say that the Arnold Palmer tea was 1 part lemonade, 2 parts tea. Arnold Palmer was 1 part champagne, 3 parts beer.
Chris, put it into context. Latrobe, Pennsylvania, it's not the biggest town in America, but it's every town in America. Yeah. So in context, when you talk about LeBron James, Michael Jordan, help our viewers understand the impact Arnold Palmer from Latrobe, Pennsylvania had on celebrity sports endorsement. And basically, he created an entire industry that's alive and well to this day.
Yeah. Kirk Douglas, Johnny Carson asked him one time, he said, who has more charisma? Who was the most charismatic person you ever met? He said, was it John Wayne? No. Was it Ronald Reagan? No. Was it Frank Sinatra? He said, the most charismatic man I ever met was Arnold Palmer.
And so when we talk about the legend of Arnold Palmer, we have to talk about what happened specifically on the date of July 9th, 1960 at this golf course. St. Andrews, Scotland, as you would know, and so many golfers know, is the birthplace of golf. Yeah. This is, I call it, Bethlehem, Mecca, and the Vatican all rolled up into one, sacred and holy ground.
Yeah.
And Chris, the British Open is going to be played in 2022 at St. Andrews. It's the 150th British Open, but the truth be known, the magnitude of what is St. Andrews, Scotland now, and what the hottest ticket in golf will be next year in 2022 would not have been possible without Arnold Palmer.
Yeah, well, he realized early on that the future of golf lay in its past, that had such rich history. And he was a very knowledgeable student of the history of the golf, and he wanted to make a global impact. So he realized as he was having success in America, and it was in 1960, he was having one of his great years, and it was at the top of his game. He realized he could be an influencer and change the game into a world phenomenon by going back to the history of it, by going back to St. Andrews. And he did that, and he created, when people saw how charismatic he was, how much joy he had for the game and for daily life, that became very infectious to them. And he created the Grand Slam that's still talked about to this day.
A lot of people don't know that it was Palmer who was, as you mentioned, Chris, he was Tiger Woods of the day, but golf was not a rich sport. It was not, when you look at the late 1950s and into 1960, there was only one superstar, but there was no money in the game. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, one of the things like I did was I went through his career day by day. I took every clip. They'd saved every clip of everything that happened to him every time he was in the newspaper. And just one example to show how golf changed. He won on one day, June 23rd, 1960. He won the 150th British Open. And just one example to show how golf changed. He won on one day, June 23rd, 1960. He won the 150th British Open. And just one example to show how golf changed. He won on one day, June 23rd, 1960. He won the 150th British Open. And just one example to show how golf changed. He won on one day, June 23rd, 1960. He won the 150th British Open. And just one example to show how golf changed. He won on one day, June 23rd, 1960. He won the 150th British Open. And just one example to show how golf changed. He won on one day, June 23rd, 1960. He won the 150th British Open. And just one example to show how golf changed. He won on one day, June 23rd, 1960. He won the 150th British Open. And just one example to show how golf which is a day like you and I remember anniversaries and birthdays. If I ever won a professional golf tournament, I'd stop everything and say, this is the year I won this professional golf tournament. Remember what a great day that was. With Arnold Palmer, June 23rd, he won the TPC championship in 1985, a senior tour, for like $20,000. Then he won 3 tournaments on 3 different days in 3 different decades for escalating prize money. It went from $5,000 in 1959 to $20,000 in 1978 to like $40,000 in 1985. And just shows you the progression of this money. Just one example like that.
And the fact remains, before Palmer appears in 1960 at the British Open, no Americans were going. My father,
it was a money loser.
It was a money loser. This is what folks today don't understand, Chris, is that there was, not only was there no money, there were no Americans competing at the British Open. There were no American tourists flocking to St. Andrews. My father is from St. Andrews. There were no long lineups for tee-off times. How do you explain the charisma and the aura and the mystique of how one guy literally puts one golf course on the map?
He was kind of like an underdog, you know, from a small town like that, and he just always relished being that guy, and he was comfortable with everybody. I like to say that he was as comfortable with the guy who worked on his car as the guy who worked on his heart. You know, he treated both people the same way, and that came through. One of the things, if you've ever been on a golf tee with him, he would make eye contact with everybody there. You know, and I was there several times. I remember it was after 9/11, the first year they had the golf tournament up at Laurel Valley. After 9/11, it was like held off a month later, and that was a very trying time for all of us. And there was about 20 of us on the tee waiting for him, and he came up and he made deliberate bracing eye contact with everybody. You know, I don't know whether he did it for everybody, but it felt like it was for everybody. You know, every individual was important to him. And I think when you get to the golf like that, he just people could see how important the British Open was to him. And he was charismatic. So they wanted to follow him. And people would say, come watch the golf tournament with me. I've never been to a golf tournament. Well, come to this one and see this guy. And that's how he started off with the British Open.
And that British Open, as you know, Chris, Arnold Palmer wanted to create the professional equivalent of the Grand Slam, won only once by Bobby Jones back in 1930. No professional has ever won a Grand Slam in a single season of all 4 tournaments.
But you know what? They always talk about it. Whoever wins the Masters first, they say, well, he's eligible for the Grand Slam now. You know, it may never happen again. But then if he wins the U.S. Open, well, he's two-fourths of the way there now. So it always goes back to that. And that's always Arnold Palmer that started it, and Bob Drum.
And Bob Drum, I wanted you to weigh in on that. Bob Drum was a Pittsburgh sports writer, and I think it's helpful for people who are very curious about how legends are created. Palmer and Drum basically made up this mythical Grand Slam, and it lives to this day.
Yeah. Bob Drum was quite a character. He was beloved, and he was, you know, just a very funny, curmudgeonly guy, and just people really loved him. And him and Palmer were on a plane talking about it. He goes, you know, I won the British Open, I won the Masters, I won the US Open. What would happen if I win the British Open and the PGA? And he said, boy, that would be a grand slam. And they both looked at each other and a light went off. And they said, this is something that could propel the sport. Like they have the FedEx Cup now, but that still doesn't resonate the way the Grand Slam does. I mean, the Grand Slam has the title, has the mystique, and it's just something that people aspire to.
In many ways, it can be argued that it was Arnold Palmer who put St. Andrews, Scotland back on the map, even though it's the birthplace of golf. When you think about the risk he took, you know, Arnold never played it safe. Chris, what are the parallels that anyone can take from that experience when he went over to Great Britain, to Scotland, at a time when nobody else was going, everybody else was staying home, but he took a chance?
And what if he failed? He came in second that year and ended up winning 2 times. But what if he had made a disaster of it? What if he played badly? What if he had a bad experience? He would have said, I'm never going back. You know, but he was determined to make it work. He played great and just lost by 1 stroke. But he said, what a wonderful time it was. I love these people. They treated me so great. Come visit them. You'll enjoy it. Come to the birthplace of golf. You know, he created that. And they never forgot it there either. They revere his memory to this day.
No question. The legacy lives on, the aura, the mystique, as we talked about, but you have a very different view of Arnold Palmer, whether it's with his wife in Latrobe, his family. Take us inside the bars, the watering holes where Arnold would frequent, and the shall we say, the softer, more personal side, Chris.
He was born in a house that was 320 yards away from the house that he was living in when he died. And he could have left, like, he could have been pampered in palaces around the planet, but he never left Latrobe, Youngstown specifically, which is a little one stoplight town. And he was part of the community. You'd see him in the bars, you'd see him in the grocery stores. And like I said, I used to brag that I was friends with Arnold Palmer. And then I realized Arnold Palmer was friends with everyone. And you'd see him everywhere. Like, and I'd go in there. My dad was one of these, like your father, revered Arnold Palmer. And I'd go in to interview him and I'd say, Mr. Palmer, I want you to know how much I'm looking forward to hearing your historic insights on these matters. He goes, and I'm looking forward to you blowing so much more sweet smoke up my ass.
Help people understand
boundaries.
There's a the Arnold Palmer brand lives on. He was the first celebrity endorser. There were the commercials, Rolex, Pennzoil. We could go on and on and on with all the corporate partnerships. But when you talk about the brand Arnold Palmer, the image that was created, just help people understand the unique relationship that involved not just Palmer, but his business advisor, Mark McCormick.
Well, they started on a handshake deal. McCormick had the idea that this guy is going to be a hot property for a long time, and people liked him. They wanted him to run for president in 1960. And he said, he goes, no, I would take too much time away from my golf. But he was really, he just had his firm believer in these products and that people would like to buy them, and they did. He had an Arnold Palmer dry cleaners chain for a while that went pretty well, and then, that moved on. But for the rest of his life, he was endorsing Callaway. He created the Golf Channel, the Golf Network channel, and he just never gave up. He was always very shrewd, but he was very genuine, and that was a big key to his success as a pitchman.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of people know to this day that the Golf Channel owes its very existence to Arnold Palmer, because he could see the future. And as you mentioned, I want to circle back to what you said, the future lies in the past. How true is that for anyone watching here today?
Oh, that's for everybody. If you have a reverence for what's gone before you, you can learn from it, and it can inspire you. And it's so key to everything we do, I think. You look back at the greats who've done what you're doing. Like for me as a writer, I look at Mark Twain and John Steinbeck, and I try and see what they do. With Arnold Palmer, he looked back at all the great athletes that he knew, and he just was just joyful about it. And he thought that it would be a very important part of his future, and he was right. He had Doc Giffen was his spokesman for like 50 years, and Doc Giffen was the PGA press secretary in 1965. And he quit. Arnold Palmer said, he goes, would you like to be my assistant and, arrange things for me and, be my right-hand man? And he quit the job as a PGA Tour secretary and press secretary. And they said, his buddies made fun of him. They said, what are you going to do? He's only going to be a golfer for a few more years. And then what are you going to do when he quits golfing? And Doc said, he goes, I think Arnold Palmer is going to be an important name for many, many decades. And he was right. He could sense that he was going to be just a genuine person that people were always going to look up to. And they did until the day he died and beyond.
As the son of a former professional golfer, Chris, and as someone who just grew up watching the game as a little kid, I think one of the most profound insights from Arnold Palmer and his legacy is that he made a lot more money off the course than he did on it. Can you weigh in on that?
Well, that goes back to his spokesman. People would pay to golf with him, and like CEOs wanted to be near Arnold Palmer, and all these people wanted to be a part of him. And that goes back to his charisma. And he understood that the golf was a game that you could play for the rest of your life. And you can play with people, like some of your best memories. You ask people, who's your foursome in heaven? They'll say, my father, my grandfather, and Arnold Palmer.
An incredible legacy. There's a statue of Arnie in Latrobe. The rest of the world might see the statue one way, Chris, but I think we'd be interested to hear, how do you view his statue and his legacy?
I just, I always go back to what a neighbor he was. You'd see him everywhere. And like, I like that Jim Nantz came to visit him in 1994 for the US Open. And Jim Nantz drove up to his door and he said, Arnold, he goes, you live right on a regular street. He goes, there's no guards, no gates, no dogs, no security, no trespassing signs. He goes, if somebody wanted to, they could come right off the street and knock on your door. And he goes, well, that happens. And he goes, Arnold, what do you do when someone knocks on your door? And Arnold said, he goes, I answer the door. And I just like that. And that's what he did. It happened a lot that people would come up and knock on the door and he'd be there just getting out of bed. And they'd say, he goes, how are you? And he goes, we just wanted to get a picture. He goes, give me 15 minutes. Come on in. And he'd have him sit down at the breakfast table with his wife and she'd be a great hostess. And he just was a great guy. And I love the story, like you'd see him at the grocery store, and a friend of mine went in there and he said, he goes, Mr. Palmer, he goes, your wife gets your dog groomed at my wife's place. And so he had this little small town connection. And then he said, Arnold saw him standing there by the lottery thing and assumed he wanted to play the lottery. He goes, let's play together. We'll see what we win. We'll split the winnings. Give me $20. So the guy said, I reached in my wallet. All I had was $20. And I gave my last $20 to Arnold Palmer, who at the time was worth $700 million. They played 4 scratch-off tickets, didn't win a dime. And Arnold said, well, you win some, you lose some. The guy said, well, you've won a hell of a lot more than I have.
There's so many stories we could.
That's what, like I said, like people said, aren't you going to do the stories of how he won this tournament? I said, I think the people that love Arnold Palmer want to know the stories of, is he a genuine guy? Was he really like that? He was really, really like that.
And I think, Chris, you would agree, your book is a great way to discover that. Besides Amazon, how do people get a hold of you and get and grab a copy of this book?
chrisrodell.com. And you can call me, email me, it's all there. And I'll be happy to. Like, I take very seriously that I represent Arnold Palmer in some small way. People said, you were really a good friend to him. As I said, he was good friends with everybody. They said, well, you were in the orbit. And I said, I was in his orbit, but I was like Pluto. And some people argue whether Pluto's even a planet anymore. But I had access to all these people. I interviewed him over 100 times over 20 years and got a real good sense of him. The last question I asked him was, do you think there's golf in heaven? And he said, oh, I believe there's golf in heaven. He goes, there's going to be like clouds for hazards. There's angels. And he started planning out the holes. But if anybody wants to get a hold of me for any reason, they can get a hold of me and I'll be happy to talk to them and share my stories with them. It's been a joy for me.
Chris, it's been a joy having you here joining us on Leaders and Legends, and continued success to Chris RODELL. He is the author of Arnold Palmer, Homespun Stories of the King. It really does say it all in terms of what the man, the myth, and the legend was all about. So, Chris, thanks again for joining us. As always, thanks to you for watching Leaders and Legends, where you never know who you're going to meet or what you'll discover.